At 66 years old, Elena Vance sat at the head of a mahogany table that she had polished every Sunday for 32 years. But what Robert and the children didn't know, what they were too blinded by their own greed to see, was that the woman they were trying to erase was the only reason they had a name worth keeping. Before this afternoon ends, the walls they are trying to build around her will become the foundation of a justice they never saw coming. If you've ever felt the people you loved most turning into strangers when money was on the line, if you've been told you were past your prime just as you were finding your strength, or if you've been discarded by the very people you built a life for, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Elena found when she reached into the dark of a forgotten desert post office will prove that the truth has a way of coming home, no matter how far you try to bury it. Elena looked at the dust motes dancing in the light of the high library windows. Robert sat to her right, his hands flat on the table, wearing the watch she had bought him for their silver anniversary. Sarah and Mark sat across from her, their phones resting face down, a rare sign of focus that only appeared when there was a contract to be signed. In the corner sat a man in a charcoal suit, holding a leather-bound notebook. They had introduced him as a friend of the family, but Elena saw the way he watched her hands. He was looking for a tremor, a slip of memory, or a moment of confusion he could record as evidence. Elena felt the silver thimble in her pocket, the cool metal pressing against her thigh. She thought about the 40 years she had spent as the silent ghost in the machinery of Vance Logistics. She had been 26 when she married Robert and took over the bookkeeping for his father's struggling warehouse. She had stayed up until dawn through 3 recessions, finding the missing pennies that kept the lights on. She had memorized the maritime codes of 6 different countries to ensure their ships never sat idle in port. When the children were young, she ran the billing department from the kitchen table, with a baby on her hip and a ledger in her lap. She had drafted the merger agreements that turned a local shipping line into a national empire, while Robert took the credit at the country club. She had sewn the buttons onto his power suits and the costumes for the children's school plays. She had ironed the shirts, managed the payroll, and scrubbed the floors when they couldn't afford a maid. She did it because she believed a family was a single knot that no one could untie. Now, she watched her son Mark lean forward. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the space just above her head. "We're just worried about you, Mom," he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "At your age, you can't manage a house of this size alone." Elena didn't blink. She looked at the tea service on the table. The silver pot was tarnished near the spout. She had been too tired to polish it the week before. She wondered if that was the detail the man in the corner was writing down. Robert cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. "Dr. Aris is here to help us make a plan, Elena. This is what's best for everyone." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the legal folder resting near Robert's elbow. Elena knew what was in that folder. Power of attorney documents, a deed of transfer for the house and the liquid assets, a brochure for a luxury assisted living facility that looked like a gilded cage. She reached into her pocket and ran her thumb over the engraved ivy leaf on her mother's thimble. It was the only thing she truly owned that hadn't been bought with Vance money. She thought about the small handwritten deed she had found in her mother's Bible a month ago. It was for a property in a town that had been removed from the state maps in the 1970s, a place called Oakhaven. She hadn't mentioned it to Robert. She hadn't mentioned the way her mother had whispered about it on her deathbed. "It's a place for when the world gets too loud, Elena," her mother had said. Elena looked at her husband. He looked like a man who had already moved on to his next deal. He looked like a man who didn't remember the kitchen table or the 3 a.m. ledgers. "You think I'm confused, Robert?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the room. The man in the corner paused his pen. Robert didn't answer. He looked at the folder. The clock on the mantel ticked once, a heavy sound in the silence. Elena realized then that they weren't waiting for her to agree. They were waiting for her to break. She stood up slowly. Her knees didn't ache, and her hands were perfectly still. She saw Sarah's eyes widen slightly. "I think I'll go for a walk," Elena said. She didn't wait for their permission. She walked out of the library and down the long hallway she had waxed 1,000 times. She didn't take a coat. She only took the thimble and the small slip of paper from the Bible. She knew they would be watching from the window. She knew they were already talking about the next steps. She walked toward the garage where her old sedan was parked. It was the only car they hadn't bothered to upgrade because they thought she didn't like to drive. She got behind the wheel and started the engine. She looked at the house in the rearview mirror. It looked like a museum where someone had forgotten to turn off the lights. She put the car in gear. She didn't look back. Elena Vance, 66 years old, watched the needle on the speedometer climb to 60. The luxury SUV she usually drove sat in the garage back at the estate. This car was a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked dashboard and a lingering smell of old peppermint. She had kept it because it was the only thing Robert hadn't tried to trade in for a newer model. He liked things that looked successful. Elena preferred things that still worked. She drove toward the desert as the green hills of the suburbs faded into the rearview mirror. 40 years of marriage felt like a heavy coat she had finally taken off. She remembered a night in 1984 when their first small warehouse flooded during a spring storm. Robert had sat on the concrete floor and put his head in his hands. Elena had spent 12 hours in knee-deep water, salvaging the paper ledgers and shipping manifests. She had dried every single page with a hairdryer on the kitchen table while the children slept. He had kissed her hands that morning and promised her the world. She had believed him because his eyes were bright, with a gratitude she thought was permanent. She spent the next decade working the night shift at the shipping docks to save on labor costs. She managed the union disputes and the equipment failures while he slept. She balanced the books with a flashlight when the power was cut to save money for the business. She skipped lunch for 3 years to save enough for the down payment on their second crane. When Sarah was born, Elena was back at the warehouse desk 3 days later. She held a calculator in one hand and a bottle in the other. She never asked for a title or a formal salary. She had thought the name on the letterhead was enough for both of them to share. She watched the desert scrub begin to replace the trees along the highway. She reached into her pocket and felt the silver thimble. The ivy leaf engraving was worn smooth in the center from years of use. Her mother had used it to sew the uniforms for the town's postal workers long ago. It was a small and heavy piece of history that fit in the palm of her hand. Elena used to keep it in a velvet-lined box on her vanity in the master suite. Now it was the only thing in her pocket besides $48.14. She remembered the way she used to start her mornings in the big house before the betrayal. She would wake at 5 and walk through the silent rooms in the dark. She would touch the edges of the furniture to make sure everything was in its proper place. She would brew a single pot of tea and drink it while looking at the previous day's spreadsheets. The house was always silent until the others woke up and began to demand things from her. Robert wanted his shirts pressed and his meetings organized. Mark wanted his tuition checked and his credit cards paid. Sarah wanted the guest list for the charity gala vetted and the catering confirmed. Elena was the engine that made the noise of their lives stop. She had been the invisible hand that smoothed the world for them for 4 decades. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel now. The knuckles were slightly swollen and the skin was thin like parchment. She was 66 years old and she was starting a new ledger on a clean page. The desert air began to smell of heat and dry sage through the vents. She checked the slip of paper resting on the passenger seat. The ink was faded, but the address was still clear. Oakhaven Post Office. It was a place she had only seen in old photographs from her mother's collection. Her mother had always looked happy in those pictures. She was standing in front of a red brick building with a wide porch and a blue door. Elena turned onto a 2-lane road that vibrated under the tires of the old sedan. The pavement was cracked and bleached, nearly white by the relentless sun. There were no more billboards advertising luxury watches or investment firms. There were no more gated communities with security guards and manicured lawns. There was only the flat horizon and the weight of the growing silence. She thought about the library meeting again and the way the doctor had looked at her. He hadn't seen a woman who built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. He had seen a problem to be solved with a signature and a prescription. He had seen a set of assets that needed a new guardian. Elena gripped the wheel tighter until her knuckles turned white. She wasn't a problem to be managed. She was the one who solved the problems for everyone else. The road began to climb into the low foothills of the mountains. The sun was a low orange ball that turned the floating dust into gold. She saw a sign leaning at a steep angle in the sand, near a dry wash. It said Oakhaven, and the population count had been scratched out with a marker. She slowed the car to a crawl as she reached the edge of the town. Everything looked like it was made of salt and dried grey wood. She felt the thimble in her pocket once more. It was cold and real. She was Elena Vance and she was 66 years old. She wasn't going to a home. She was going to the only place that still belonged to her. The library smelled of old paper and the cold, sharp scent of Robert's expensive cologne. Elena Vance, 66 years old, sat perfectly still as the man in the charcoal suit opened his leather notebook. "Elena, we only want what is safest for you," Robert said, leaning forward with a practiced look of concern. He touched the edge of the gold-rimmed teacup but didn't drink. Sarah looked at her diamond-encrusted watch and then tapped a rhythmic beat on the mahogany table with her manicured nails. "We've already toured the facility, Mom," Sarah said, her voice bright and hollow. "The gardens are lovely, and you'll have 24-hour assistance for your medications." "I don't take medications, Sarah," Elena said quietly. Mark didn't look up from his phone. "That's exactly what we mean," he muttered, his thumb scrolling rapidly. "You forget things, Mum. You forget who built all of this." Elena looked at her son, the boy she had tutored in math until midnight every night, so he wouldn't fail out of boarding school. The man in the corner, Dr. Aris, finally looked up from his notes. He didn't look like a friend of the family. He looked like a man who was counting the minutes until his invoice was paid. "Mrs. Vance," the doctor said, "your husband has shared his concerns about your recent erratic behavior regarding the company ledgers." Robert squeezed Elena's hand, his grip tight and bloodless. "It's okay, honey. You don't have to carry the weight anymore. Just sign the transition papers." He pushed a thick stack of documents across the table. Elena looked at the signature line. She saw the way Sarah's eyes locked onto the paper like a hawk spotting movement in the grass. "The mansion to the husband," Elena whispered, the rhythm of the loss beginning to beat in her chest. "The bank accounts to the husband, the investment portfolios to the children." While they exchanged victorious glances, already planning how to spend their early inheritance, Elena received what they called the rest. Robert cleared his throat, his face turning a shade of calculated pity. "You'll have the old post office in Oakhaven, Elena. It's what you always said, you wanted peace and quiet in the desert." He didn't mention that the town had been a ghost for 50 years. He didn't mention that the roof had likely collapsed before Mark was born. "You should have been more financially responsible, Elena," Robert said, his mask of concern slipping for just a second. 4 decades is a long time to string someone along, even if you were essentially just the help. The room went cold. Dr. Aris stood up and walked toward the table, but he didn't look at Robert. He looked at Elena. "Mr. Vance," the doctor said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Like a blade. I was hired to confirm your wife's cognitive decline." He turned the leather notebook around so Robert could see the pages. They were filled with detailed timelines of Robert's offshore transfers and the children's secret debt records. "But in 40 minutes of observation, I have found nothing wrong with Elena's mind. I have, however, found everything wrong with the plan you discussed in the hallway before I entered." Robert's face went white. Sarah stopped tapping her nails. "This is a private family matter," Robert hissed, his hands trembling as he tried to pull the papers back. Elena placed her hand firmly on top of the documents. She looked at her husband, the man she had protected from his own failures for 40 years. "The doctor is right, Robert," she said. "My mind is perfectly clear. I remember the 3A.M. ledgers you couldn't balance. I remember the signatures you asked me to forge because you were too afraid of the risk. I remember exactly who built this empire." She stood up and picked up the silver thimble from the table. She didn't sign the transition papers. She didn't scream or cry. "You can keep the house, Robert," she said, her voice as steady as a mountain. "You can keep the accounts that are drowning in the debt Mark tried to hide. I'll take the post office." She walked toward the door without looking at her children. She could hear Sarah starting to argue with Robert before the heavy oak door even closed. The air in the hallway felt thin and sharp. She walked past the portraits of a family that didn't exist anymore. She was still Elena Vance. Elena Vance, 66 years old, pulled the old sedan into a rest area 3 hours outside the city. The concrete lot was cracked, and a single light pole hummed with a low, electric buzz. She turned off the engine and sat in the sudden, ringing silence. The air coming through the cracked window was cooler now. It smelled of dry earth and the coming rain. She reached for her leather handbag and pulled out the small silk coin purse. She laid the money out on the dashboard. 2 $20 bills, 1 $5 bill, 3 singles. She dug through the lining of the bag and found a dime and 4 pennies, $48.14. It was the price of a single lunch at the club, where Robert was likely sitting right now. It was the cost of one of Sarah's silk scarves. Now, it was the sum of Elena's life. She looked at the smartphone resting in the cup holder. She waited for a buzz or a chime. She waited for Sarah to realize she had gone too far. She waited for Mark to call and say he was sorry. The screen remained a black, glassy mirror. She picked it up and checked the signal. 2 bars. She opened the messaging app. The last message from Robert was a week old. It was a request for a dry cleaning receipt she had forgotten to file. She looked at the family group chat. The last photo was of Mark and Sarah at a beach club. Elena wasn't in the photo. She hadn't even been invited on the trip. She realized they had been living without her long before the library meeting. She had been a ghost in her own home for years. She deleted the chat. She turned the phone off and placed it face down on the passenger seat. The quiet in the car felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She reached into her pocket and found the silver thimble. She held it up to the light of the humming pole. The silver gleamed with a soft, steady light. It was small, but it was solid. It didn't require a battery or a signal to exist. It didn't need anyone's permission to be useful. Her mother had lived in Oakhaven when the mines were still open. She had been the woman who made sure the mail went to the right families. She had been the one who kept the town's stories alive in her letters. Elena felt a sudden, sharp pull toward the desert. It wasn't a choice made out of logic. It was a choice made out of survival. She had nowhere else to go. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but the road behind was a graveyard of things she no longer owned. She put the money back into the purse. She put the thimble back into her pocket. She started the car. She turned the steering wheel toward the east. The headlights cut a narrow path through the sagebrush and sand. She was still Elena Vance. At 66 years old, Elena Vance felt the steering wheel of the old sedan vibrate as the pavement finally gave way to gravel and sand. The headlights cut through a darkness so thick it felt like a physical barrier against the windshield. She watched the fuel needle dip toward the red line as a single, flickering light appeared on the horizon. It was a lone bulb, hanging over the porch of a building that looked like it was being swallowed by the desert floor. Elena slowed the car to a crawl as she passed a rusted sign that leaned at a sharp angle in the dirt. The town of Oakhaven consisted of a single street lined with structures that looked like grey skeletons under the moon. She saw a general store with a faded awning that had once been yellow, but was now the color of old bone. Next to it sat a small diner with checkered curtains that hung stiff and grey with decades of accumulated dust. A white church with a modest steeple stood at the far end of the road, its wooden doors sealed shut with rusted chains. She pulled the car to a stop near a gas station that had only 2 pumps, their glass faces cracked and clouded by the sun. A man sat in a high-backed wooden chair on the porch of the general store. He wore a denim jacket that had been washed until it was nearly white and a cap pulled low over his eyes. Elena got out of the car and felt the heat of the desert night press against her skin. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of her cooling engine. She walked toward the porch, her shoes crunching loudly on the dry grit. The man didn't move as she approached the steps. He didn't ask who she was or what a woman in a city coat was doing in a dead town at midnight. He simply tilted his head back until the light of the bulb hit his face. His skin was the color of mahogany and lined with deep tracks that looked like they had been carved by the wind. "You took your time getting here, Elena," the man said. Elena stopped with one foot on the bottom step. She had never been to Oakhaven, and she had never seen this man in her life. She reached into her pocket and gripped the silver thimble. "How do you know my name?" she asked. The man stood up slowly, his joints popping in the quiet air. He was tall and lean, like a piece of desert timber that had been stripped of its bark. "I'm Silas," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Your mother told us to watch for a woman with an ivy leaf around her neck or in her pocket. She said you'd come eventually after she passed. She said you were the one who knew how to keep the books and fix what was broken." Silas pointed a long, calloused finger toward a building across the narrow dirt road. It was a red brick structure that sat lower than the others, as if it were rooted deeper into the earth. Dead vines hung from the walls in thick, tangled mats that looked like iron wool. The porch was sagging on the left side, and the windows were dark and coated in a thick layer of grime. "That's the Oakhaven Post Office," Silas said. "It hasn't seen a piece of mail since 1972, but the roof holds, and the floor is solid oak." Elena looked at the building. It was worse than the description Robert had given her during the library meeting. He had called it a property, but to anyone else, it would have looked like a pile of debris. The blue paint on the door was peeling in long, curled strips that fluttered in the light breeze. One of the front windows was cracked in the shape of a spider web, but as Elena stepped closer to the building, she saw a small detail that stopped her breath. Above the heavy brass door handle, a small ivy leaf had been carved into the wood. The carving was precise and delicate, matching the engraving on her thimble exactly. She reached into her purse and pulled out the heavy iron key her mother had left in the Bible. Her hands were steady as she fit the key into the lock. The metal was cold and felt like it had been waiting for her touch. She turned the key. The lock didn't groan or resist. It clicked with a clean, sharp sound that echoed off the empty buildings across the street. Elena pushed the door open. The air that spilled out was cold and smelled of cedar, old paper, and the particular sweetness of desert rain. She stepped over the threshold and into the dark. She reached out and touched the wall, feeling the rough texture of the brick. She was 66 years old, and she had $4.14 left in her purse. She was standing in a room filled with dust and shadows, in a town that the world had forgotten. She didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel like the discarded woman Robert and the children had tried to create. She felt like she was finally standing on ground that wouldn't shift under her feet. She reached into her pocket and set the silver thimble on the high wooden sorting counter. The silver gleamed in the moonlight coming through the cracked window. She was home. Elena Vance, 66 years old, woke on a pile of empty burlap mail sacks she had dragged into the corner of the sorting room. The air was so cold it made her teeth ache. When she tried to stand, her lower back seized in a sharp, electric knot that forced her to stay on her knees for 3 minutes. She crawled to the sorting desk and pulled herself up. Her hands were covered in a fine, grey silt that had settled into the deep lines of her palms. She walked to the small sink in the back room and turned the brass handle. A dry, hollow rattle echoed through the pipes, but no water came. She had $48.14 left in the world, and she did not have running water. Elena didn't sit down to cry. She found a rusted, galvanized bucket behind the counter and walked out into the early light. The desert was silent, and the air smelled of dry sage and old wood. She walked toward the gas station pumps, where Silas was already sitting in his wooden chair. He didn't say good morning. He pointed toward a spigot on the side of the general store. "The pump works, but the water tastes like iron," Silas said. He stood up and walked over to her, his boots leaving heavy prints in the dust. He held out a small, blue tin cup filled with black coffee. "You'll need this more than the water right now." Elena took the cup. The heat of the tin felt like a miracle against her frozen fingers. "Thank you, Silas." Elena spent the next 6 hours on her hands and knees. She didn't have a mop, so she tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her spare slip. She used the iron-tasting water and a handful of coarse sand to scrub the grime from the oak floorboards. By noon, her knees were swollen and purple, and her shoulders felt like they were being pressed down by lead weights. She found a stack of discarded newspapers from 1972 in a closet. She used them to clean the windows until the glass began to show the desert horizon instead of grey streaks. She salvaged a broken broom handle and a piece of wire to fish a bird's nest out of the chimney. Every movement was a calculation of pain and necessity. She didn't think about the mahogany table or the silk sheets she had left behind. She thought about the next square foot of wood. She thought about the next bucket of water. As the sun began to set, the wind shifted, and the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The first heavy drops of rain hit the roof, with the sound of gravel falling on tin. Elena stood in the center of the sorting room and looked up. A dark circle began to spread on the ceiling near the back wall. Then another appeared over the sorting desk, where she had placed her thimble. The water began to drip, a rhythmic, mocking sound in the empty space. She scrambled to find containers, but she only had the one bucket and the blue tin cup. She looked at the ceiling, then at her swollen, shaking hands. She thought, "I cannot fix a leaky roof. I'm 66 years old with $48.14, and I cannot fix a leaky roof." The math beyond that was too large to look at directly. She sat on the floor and pulled her phone from her pocket. The battery was at 4%. She looked at the screen. No missed calls, no texts from Sarah, no messages from Mark asking if she had made it. No texts from Sarah, no messages from Mark asking if she had made it to the desert. The last notification was an automated alert from her bank, informing her that her access to the joint account had been restricted. The screen flickered once and went black. She felt the cold dampness of the floor soaking into her trousers. She thought about the assisted living facility Sarah had described. It would be warm there. There would be someone to fix the roof and someone to bring her a tray of food. She could call Robert from the general store in the morning and tell him she was done. She could tell him he won. She leaned her head against the sorting desk and closed her eyes. This is where I die, she thought. Not tonight, but this is where it ends. This is what dying alone looks like. The rain grew louder, a roar against the metal roof. A stray drop fell from the ceiling and landed directly on the silver thimble. The water caught the light of a lightning flash and made the silver ivy leaf glow for a fraction of a second. Elena looked at the thimble. She reached up and touched the cool metal. She remembered her mother sitting in this very room, sewing the canvas mail bags with this thimble. She remembered her mother saying that a stitch in time was the only thing that kept the world from unraveling. Elena stood up. Her back screamed and her knees throbbed, but she pushed herself to her feet. She grabbed the rusted bucket and emptied the sand-filled water out the front door. She went back and found an old heavy tarp that had been covering a stack of crates. She dragged it toward the ladder leading to the attic crawlspace. "I'm not dying in this post office," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm 66 years old, and I still know how to balance a ledger." She kept climbing. Elena Vance, 66 years old, pushed the heavy oak sorting desk 3 inches to the left to reach the base of the leaking wall. The wood groaned against the floor, a sound that felt like a scream in the small, empty room. She saw a dark, damp square where the desk had sat for 50 years. One floorboard was not nailed down. It was tucked slightly under the molding, its edge worn smooth by the passage of time. Elena knelt on the damp wood, her knees clicking with a sharp, dry sound. She used the edge of her mother's silver thimble to pry the board upward. The wood gave way with a soft sigh. Beneath the floor lay a narrow metal box wrapped in heavy, black oilcloth. Elena pulled the box out and set it on the dusty floorboards. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the thimble fell from her fingers and rolled across the floor. She had to close her eyes and count to 10 before she could reach for the lid. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps that felt like glass in her throat. She lifted the lid. Inside were thick bundles of parchment, tied with faded black silk ribbon. She picked up the top document and smoothed it out on her lap. The paper was heavy and smelled of cedar and old ink. At the top of the page, the words Vance Maritime and Logistics were written in her mother's elegant, scrolling hand. Elena read the words. She read them again. She traced the lines with a finger that was stained with desert dust. These were the original partnership deeds from 1984. These were the documents Robert claimed had burned in the warehouse fire 3 decades ago. He had told her the company was built on his family's capital. He had used that lie to keep her from ever owning a single share of the business she ran. But the ink on the page said something very different. The land was hers. The initial investment was her mother's. Robert's name appeared only as an authorized manager, not an owner. Elena reached deeper into the box and found a smaller, sealed envelope. She tore it open with shaking fingers. Inside was a list of account numbers and foreign bank codes she recognized instantly. They were the offshore accounts Robert had used to hide the profits from the children. They were the accounts he thought were invisible. Her mother had seen everything. Her mother had been the quiet bookkeeper before Elena, and she had kept the proof. Elena looked at the paper, then at the silver thimble resting in the dust. She realized that she didn't just have a roof over her head. She had the keys to the empire they were trying to bury her under. She spoke aloud to the empty room, her voice steady for the first time since she arrived. "You forgot who built the house, Robert." She sat on the floor and pulled the documents to her chest. The rain was still falling, but she was no longer cold. The sun rose over the desert the next morning, turning the grey sand into a sheet of hammered brass. Elena Vance, 66 years old, did not wait for the heat to settle. She walked across the road to the general store with her leather notebook and a pen she had found in the sorting desk. Silas was sitting on his porch, a stack of crumpled invoices weighted down by a rusted alternator. Elena didn't ask for a loan or a favor. "You have 6 years of unfiled tax records and 3 vendors who have been overcharging you for freight," she said. Silas looked at her, then at the chaotic pile of papers on the crate beside him. Silas didn't smile, but he stood up and opened the heavy wooden door to the store's warehouse. "I've got a ladder and a bucket of sealant too," he said. Elena spent the next 4 days on the roof of the post office. She crawled on her hands and knees across the hot tin, her palms protected by a pair of heavy work gloves. Her shoulders burned under the sun, and the scent of the tar was thick and suffocating in the desert wind. She patched the holes over the sorting desk first. She hammered the loose edges of the metal sheets back into the rafters. When the roof was sealed, she turned her attention to the vines. She used a rusted garden spade to hack away the thick, dry mats of ivy that had choked the brickwork for decades. Underneath the dead leaves, the red bricks were still warm and solid. She scrubbed the exterior of the building with a stiff brush and buckets of the iron-tasting water from the spigot. The dust of 50 years washed away in muddy rivers that soaked into the thirsty sand. She used a small portion of her $48 to buy a quart of blue paint from Silas. It wasn't the exact shade of the original door, but it was the color of the desert sky at dusk. She spent 3 hours on her knees painting the front door, her strokes slow and deliberate. She painted around the carved ivy leaf near the handle, leaving the bare wood exposed as a reminder. Inside, she focused on the oak sorting desk. She used a mixture of linseed oil and fine sand to strip away water stains. The wood began to glow, a deep honey gold that caught the afternoon light. She found a box of brass hinges in the back room and used them to fix the hanging cabinet doors. She didn't have money for new glass, so she polished the cracked pane until the spiderweb pattern looked like a deliberate piece of art. By the end of the second week, the post office no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a sentinel. The windows were clear and reflected the mountains like twin mirrors. The blue door stood out against the red brick, like a promise kept. The interior smelled of cedar oil and the clean, sharp scent of the desert air. Elena stood in the center of the room and watched the light move across the floor. The shadows no longer looked like they were hiding secrets. They looked like they were holding a space for what was coming next. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver thimble. She placed it on the corner of the polished desk. The silver caught a beam of light and threw a small, bright star onto the wall. It was the first beautiful thing she had seen in a long time. She sat in the high-backed chair behind the counter and opened her ledger. She wasn't a ghost in someone else's house anymore. She was the master of her own. Elena Vance, 66 years old, sat in the high-backed chair and watched the dust motes settle on the polished oak of the sorting desk. The silence of Oakhaven was no longer a weight pressing against her chest. It was a clean, open space that she filled with the scratch of her pen and the steady rhythm of her breathing. She reached out and touched the silver thimble where it sat on the corner of the desk. "I found them, Mum," she whispered to the empty, sun-drenched room. "I found the ledger and the truth you left under the floor." She looked at the blue door and the way the light caught the peeling paint on the doorframe. She felt a strange, cool sensation in her hands that she hadn't felt in 40 years. It was the absence of a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. She wasn't waiting for Robert to approve of her work or for Sarah to acknowledge her presence. She was simply Elena. It was the first time she had felt peace since the night the warehouse flooded in 1984. The transformation of the town began on a Tuesday afternoon. A dusty white pickup truck pulled up to the post office, and a man in a stained canvas coat stepped out. He didn't look like the lawyers or the executives who populated Elena's old life. He looked like a man who spent his days fighting the wind and the sand. He walked up the steps and removed his hat before he reached the door. "Silas said there was a woman here who knew how to read a grazing lease," the man said. He set a crumpled folder on the counter and looked at Elena with eyes that were tired and sharp. Elena didn't ask his name or his business. She opened the folder and saw a mess of legal jargon and predatory interest rates. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from her drawer and began to work. She didn't use a calculator. She used the mental math she had perfected while nursing her children at the kitchen table. Within 20 minutes, she had found the 4% discrepancy that was costing the man his ranch. She showed him the line in the contract, and the way the math didn't hold its own weight. The man didn't thank her with money. He returned 2 hours later with a crate of fresh oranges and a gallon of spring water that didn't taste like iron. "Word's going around the valley," the man said as he leaned against the doorframe. "They say the Oakhaven Post Office is open for business again." By the end of the week, 3 more trucks had found their way to the red brick building. A woman from a small vineyard brought her tax records. A mechanic from the next town over brought a partnership agreement he didn't understand. They didn't come to rescue her or to offer her charity. They came because they needed the precision that only she could provide. They recognized the calloused skin on her hands and the steady look in her eyes. They were people who understood that value wasn't found in a title or a mansion. It was found in the work. Elena spent her evenings sitting on the front porch with Silas. They didn't talk much. They watched the stars come out over the mountains and listened to the desert owls. Elena realized she was no longer looking at her phone to see if her children had called. She was looking at the horizon to see what the weather would bring for the morning's work. She had reclaimed the identity that Robert had tried to bury under a pile of medical reports and legal threats. She was the woman who kept the world from unraveling, one stitch at a time. She was complete within herself. Elena Vance, 66 years old, was polishing the brass scale on the sorting desk when the sound of a high-performance engine broke the desert silence. A black SUV with tinted windows slowed as it entered the ghost town, kicking up a plume of white dust that settled on the blue paint of the post office door. Robert stepped out of the vehicle first, his Italian leather loafers sinking into the grit of the road. He looked at the restored brickwork and the clear windows, with the expression that hovered between surprise and calculation. Sarah followed him, shielding her eyes from the sun and checking her phone. Though there was no signal for miles, Elena did not move from behind the counter. She felt the weight of the silver thimble in her pocket and the stack of maritime deeds resting in the locked drawer beneath her hand. Robert walked up the wooden steps, his suit jacket open, trying to project the easy confidence of a man closing a minor deal. He stopped at the threshold and looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the polished oak and the organized ledgers. "You've done a lot with this place, Elena," he said, his voice dropping into that familiar tone of manufactured warmth. "It's impressive, really, but we're just being realistic about the long term. Oakhaven isn't a place for a woman of your standing to live out her years." Sarah stepped inside and leaned against the doorframe, looking at the dust on her sleeves with visible distaste. "We're just worried about you, Mum," Sarah said, repeating the line from the library. "The wind, the heat, the lack of proper medical facilities. It's not what's best for everyone." Elena looked at her daughter, noting the way Sarah's eyes kept darting to the sorting desk drawers. "What is it you want, Robert?" Elena asked. Her voice didn't shake. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years finding the missing pennies in $1 million ledger. Robert cleared his throat and stepped closer to the counter, lowering his voice, as if they were sharing a secret. "We know about the box, Elena. Silas has been talking at the county seat. The old maritime deeds from '84. They're company property. They belong in the corporate vault, not in a drafty room in the middle of nowhere." He reached out to touch her hand, but Elena moved it back, resting her fingers on the edge of the brass scale. "You're not getting nothing, Elena," Robert said, his mask finally slipping just enough for the truth to show through. "We'll increase the monthly allowance for the facility. We'll make sure you have the best suite. Just hand over the documents, and let's put this messy business behind us." He looked at his gold watch, then at the door, as if he were already mentally back on the highway. Elena looked at her husband, the man who had called her the help in front of a psychiatrist. "You gave me this post office because you thought it was a ruin," she said. "You thought the town was dead and I was finished. But you forgot that I'm the one who kept the records while you were at the club. I'm the one who knew which floorboard groaned and where the secrets were buried." She pulled the silver thimble from her pocket and set it on the counter between them. "These deeds prove that Vance Logistics was built on my mother's capital and my labor. They prove that you've been a manager of my assets for 40 years, Robert. I'm not signing anything. I'm not going to a home. And I'm certainly not handing you the keys to a life you never earned." Robert's face turned a deep, mottled red, and his hands balled into fists at his sides. "You can't do this, Elena. We'll tie you up in court for a decade. You're an old woman with a bucket of paint and a desert shack." Elena stood up straight, her head held high, the sunlight catching the silver in her hair. "I have the original maritime filings and the foreign account codes you thought were deleted," she said. "If you want to go to court, we can start with the tax fraud from 1998. Or we can talk about the signatures you asked me to forge. The choice is yours, Robert. But you should know that I've already sent copies to an attorney who doesn't play golf with you." The silence that followed was absolute. Robert looked at the thimble, then at the steady, cold fire in Elena's eyes. He realized for the first time in 40 years that he was not the one in control. He turned without another word and walked out of the post office, his shoes dragging in the dirt. Sarah looked at her mother, her mouth open as if to say something, but the look on Elena's face stopped her. She turned and followed her father into the black SUV. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped away, leaving a cloud of dust that hung in the air for a long time. Elena watched them go until the taillights disappeared over the rise of the hill. She picked up the silver thimble and put it back in her pocket. She went back to her ledger. The door clicked shut behind them. 1 year after the morning she arrived, the desert was in bloom. Elena Vance, 66 years old, stood on the porch of the Oakhaven Post Office. The red bricks glowed in the soft light of dawn. A new brass sign hung over the door. It read, "Vance Document and History Services." The windows were clean and reflected the purple mountains on the horizon. She watched a small dust cloud growing on the long dirt road. It was the morning mail truck coming from the county seat. Elena went inside and sat at the high oak desk. The wood was dark and rich from a year of daily care. She picked up a heavy canvas mailbag that needed a repair. She slid the silver thimble onto her middle finger. The engraved ivy leaf felt warm and familiar against her skin. She began to stitch a loose seam in the heavy fabric. Her hands were steady. Her mind was quiet. She looked at the small black and white photograph of her mother resting against the brass scale. "We kept the doors open, Mama," she said. Elena's journey proves that the world cannot take what you have built within yourself. It shows that being discarded is often just a redirection toward the place where you truly belong. Justice is not always a gavel in a crowded courtroom. Sometimes justice is a blue door and a clean ledger in a town everyone else forgot. If Elena's story moved you, if you've ever felt like a ghost in your own home while building someone else's dream, thank you for being here. Leave one word in the comments describing how you felt when Elena refused to sign those papers in the library, because Elena's story proves something that is always true. The hands that do the work are the only hands that truly hold the power. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their value is not determined by those who fail to see it, because together we prove that dreams don't age.